Hello and welcome to Speaking Frankly, where we feature honest talk with thought leaders across the advertising ecosystem and beyond. I am Kim Frank, your host and GeoPath president. So today I am super excited to be joined by Bill Harvey. He is the founder and chairman of Research Measurement Technology, or RMT, and he is a fellow member of the Market Research Council. Bill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Kim.
So you were awarded the very first Erwin Efron Demystification Award in 2014 from the ARF, the Advertising Research Foundation. You are an absolute research legend and icon. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your career and how you got to where you are today?
Well, I had an immediate benefit when I got out of school, winding up in the advertising business, which I never expected to love, but I do. And I knew it immediately. And I loved the people and their intellects and their being human beings and sensitive to human beings and great mentors and teachers and always willing. And I wound up at Gray Advertising, which on my website, the Bill Harvey Consulting website, I acknowledge, all of these people by name. That would take this whole session though to list them. So I was really lucky to wind up at Gray, but it wasn't just Gray. It was the madman era, and I'm still a madman. And during the madman era, the media research cadres at the various major agencies, particularly Gray, Benton & Bowles, BBDO, J. Walter Thompson, Y&R, Ogilvy, those six, but all of them had incredible people and very willing to teach and train. In fact, they insisted on doing it. So this classical media research training was something very valuable that I got. What I brought to the party, and the other lucky thing was, they said, Bill, you're going to work on our media optimizer. BBDO and Y&R have media optimizers. We don't have one. We need one. And I said, I'll do it. What is it? In that order. And then I've worked on optimizers throughout my career. So I'm really lucky there too. So a lot of luck and a lot of good people and mentors. And working on my passion work. When you can work on something you really love, you can be a sponge and you can get into the flow state and you can do your best work. So, but back in school, I had been very interested in two subjects, psychology and philosophy, and always wanting to look at the relationships between those. So of course I applied that lens as soon as I got into the advertising business. And people at Gray would stop and say, well, what do you mean by that? And, I was talking about motivations and all kinds of things. I wanted to go below the surface that we were dealing on of reach frequency. I wanted to say, well, what about the business effects? And how does it work? What is the brain signature of persuasion? And, we do day after recall and we do persuasion measures, attitude shift measures. What's really going on below the data that we get back? How do we understand that better? So that was my holistic idea. Never allowed me to just look at things through a media lens. It was always media and creative, a whole consumer experience. So I think those were the things that differentiated me and gave me an interesting, fun career.
Yeah, and you made some really, you've done some really revolutionary work throughout your career. So you and I were discussing earlier some of the big discoveries that you made over the last few decades. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. In the 90s, my company, Next Century Media, was the first company to do addressable television. And we did it programmatically, which today's addressable television, other than, CTV, OTT, yeah, that is being done programmatically. We're doing it, and it's wonderful. But the MVPD and smart TV form of addressable TV is anything but programmatic. It's not the easiest medium to buy. So Next Century Media had the first set-top box data to research grade, the first data-driven program recommender. Now that's where the real discoveries came out of, because from my first days in the industry, I'd been interested in context effects. I knew intuitively that a commercial would perform differently in a different program environment. And so I wanted to understand that, but to do that, you'd have to be able to content code the ad and the program. So then what would be the content codes? Are you just going to make those up, or look at the literature to see what people have used to code commercials, which was pretty simplistic, happy versus serious and so on and so forth. So we started with every word in the English language, and we used an empirical means to distill that down to the smallest possible number of words that had the most impact on the program recommendations, leading to a conversion to somebody watching a program loyally 3 out of 4 episodes after the recommendation that they had never watched before, according to their set-top box data. So we were able to recommend a show in real time through the interactive system that ultimately we were getting 18% conversion rates with these 265 psychological attributes, which we call driver tags, which are a mixture of human values, mindsets, motivations, character and personality traits, moods and emotions. People immediately think they must all be moods and emotions, but that's only about 20% of them. Anyway, so these driver tags were discovered by the Next Century Media process now today at RMT, but that's kind of getting ahead of the story, because the next decade, what we did was create a company called TRA. And TRA was really a continuation of the work of NCM, but with an emphasis on making single source economically sustainable. Single source had started in the 1970s with Colin MacDonald in England having 2 different diaries filled out by the same panelists, a purchase diary and a TV diary. And then using that diary data, started to look at, well, they saw this program which had these commercials in it, therefore they probably saw these commercials. And sure enough, those products, the sales increased. We see the time series relationship, and so we have something promising. So then that led to things like AdTel and Behavior Scan, Scan America, and then ultimately it led to the Apollo project. Now, all of these things went out of business, and they were single source panels in other countries that went out of business. They couldn't sustain them, even with a sample size as small as 5,000, which Apollo was using. And with a 5,000 sample size, looking at brand effects based on small, fragmented audiences and so on and so forth, you could only do good work for Tide and Coca-Cola, and you couldn't, most of the brands, you couldn't get statistically significant. So Apollo went out of business. So I saw that coming while Apollo was peaking. And they said, no, we're not going to go out of business. And I said, I'm afraid you might. So I started to develop TRA, and then TRA went into business before Apollo went out of business. And we showed that by using naturally occurring data, not a panel that's been recruited, not research cooperators that represent only people who will cooperate with research, but everybody, you're getting measurements that weren't intended to be research. They're just log files from digital or traditional TV set-top box data, or subscriber lists, or people potentially who were tracked passing a sign, or whatever it might be, but naturally occurring data where you could do the Apollo shtick on huge sample sizes and sustainably over time, which everyone could afford. So that was one of TRA's big discoveries. The other, and of course, everybody's doing it now. I got 4 issued US patents that TiVo now owns, and TiVo's usually, into litigation, but they haven't sued the 1,000 different companies that are using the TRA stuff. But the other thing we discovered was that 80% of advertising has effects on people who have used the brand before, but aren't now loyally using it. So we called them heavy swing purchasers, meaning we narrowed it down to category heavies because that automatically bumps up the value of the ROI. And we narrowed it down to what we called swing, was anybody who bought the brand in the last 3 years, but doesn't buy it loyally. But on the user interface, you had a slider. You could decide, I want people who haven't used it more than 1% of their purchases, people who haven't done more than 75% of their purchases weighted by dollars or units. We had all those choices. But anyway, what we found was if you simply targeted heavy swing purchasers, you would get on average a 28% ROI bump. In fact, the index, the audience index, a la MRI and Simmons, the way of calculating an index, if you could get the heavy swing purchasers to be, normally it was like 100 index because people weren't buying against it, planning against it. They didn't know it existed. So typically, if you look at a plan and analyze it, you'd see the index against heavy swing purchasers was 100 or around 100. If you could get that up to 110, you'd get a 7% increase in ROI. You'd get 70% of the audience lift index translates into ROI. So that 70% relationship was a discovery.
That's fascinating. So really tells the story of targeting and the importance of targeting.
Yeah, it's funny how it's gotten perverted and gamed by no names being mentioned, but there are people who are targeting loyals so they can take credit for the conversion, quote unquote, because even if there was no ad, they were going to buy it.
Right.
Looks like. So if you target the loyal, and if you do that in a way where it's not too obvious, the customer goes away happy and thinks they've gotten great ROI. Unfortunately, so there's good targeting, there's bad targeting. Deterministic targeting is much better than lookalikes. I did some work in 2017 with Simmons, and we found that demographically based lookalikes only explain 6% of the variance in brain. And then if you added driver text to that, you could double it. But still, lookalikes don't work as well as deterministic, which is going to be interesting as we move into the privacy boomerang situation that we're going into now, where data that we've had, we're not going to necessarily have as much of. It'll be very interesting to see.
So that's a good segue. I mean, it is an interesting time to be a futurist. But you're doing some work on the future of marketing. So what are you thinking? What are you seeing? What are you predicting?
Well, we're trying to integrate all databases in a UI as close as we can come in beauty and utility to what you've built at Geopath. That's been the kind of a UI I've wanted to have for 20, 30 years. And the great technologists I worked with made that a very low priority. They said, look, we've agreed on the roadmap. You asked for 100 different features and we've got them all scheduled. And none of them include beautifying the user interface to go away. But besides the beauty and utility of it, what we're trying to do is make everything as programmatic as possible. We're trying to unify across platforms, across media types, across countries. And so that's the work I'm doing, working in different countries, working in the US, working with companies like Reset Digital. Reset Digital, incidentally, is my one success case in terms of a user interface that comes into your class of user interface. Charles Cantu and the team, it's a programmatic company. They took RMT's technology and they embodied it in a beautifully visual interface for buying programmatic OTT, CTV, and even display. Did a great job with it. So trying to put all of these things together, I'm trying to also be sensitive to the future of agencies to some extent depends on being able to have their own bespoke technologies that nobody else has. And so I think of those as agency on-ramps where they can draw upon big pools of data and analytics that have been made convenient for them, but also add their own special sauce on top. So I do think that it's going to be a programmatic all media future, but it's going to start very differently. It's going to start brands, I feel, marketers need to own their own creative brief. They shouldn't outsource the creative brief because then they're not marketers anymore. To be marketers, they have to understand the why of why people like their product, why they use their product, and how to make the product better, how to make the consumer happier with it, how to make people's lives better by listening to them deeply enough. Now, surveys and social media statements are just reaching the verbal memory and are not reaching all of the internal subconscious motivators and so on. If you ask people why they buy X, they'll give you an answer, which might indeed be different from what they'll give you next week. But they're making it up, really. They don't understand why they do what they do. So the ability to passively infer a person's motivations from the TV shows they watch and the content they consume online, which is, started at Next Century Media, and now we're doing it big time with RMT. We've productized that program recommender into something that's more of an ad context recommender and an ad target recommender. How do you pick targets who have the motivations that your brand's ads are communicating? So to understand people's motivations, and there's two types of motivations. There's product-specific motivations, like breath freshening versus tooth whitening, versus decay prevention in the toothpaste category. But then there's life motivations. There's the things that motivate us as human beings, and that's much more important. And using them both together is what I'm espousing. I think in the future of marketing, there'll be processes for using survey data, but also passive data to understand the motivations that we've been communicating for our brand, where they've been successful and unsuccessful, which ad campaigns that we've run have executed against those motivations better, and how do we read that from the ROI and the branding data. And from that, and looking also at what the competition's been doing in the motivations in their ads and the motivations in the people that they're, and looking at the people that go to both my brand and its competitors, people who are multi-brand users, which are more the rule nowadays, particularly in CPG and in retail. Multi-brand users is the most common modality. To look at the shared user group, because that's where I had the chance of stealing some more brand growth from myself, from specific competitors, to look at the overlap of what we've been communicating in our ads with what they've been communicating and who they've been reaching and who we've been reaching, and how all of that meshes into a new idea for adding an attribution, adding an attribute to our brand, adding a perception to our brand, adding one that it basically resonates with the motivations of the group we see as our most pregnant target group. So that's going to be a new feature that isn't being done. That will lead to greater creativity. The ads themselves are going to be a mixture of ads and branded content. Right now, it's 90% ads, 10% of the budget goes to branded content. But if you read my article that came out in Media Village on the date we recorded this, which was the 25th of March, you'll see that trust for advertising has been going down, but not for branded content. There's high degrees of trust for branded content. So there's going to be, in the future of marketing, much more of a balance between those things. I think television is going to come back as a medium. As the measurements get more accurate, television's power will become more clear. And we'll find a way to bring outdoor into this. You've made the basic data steps. You've got it all ready and set up to go. A couple of more linkages would do the trick, as you know, and maybe we'll get a chance to discuss that too. But I don't want to deviate from your question. But I think
cross-platform measurement has really been the holy grail, right, for decades. Do you think that we will ever truly see a cross-platform measurement system with common metrics and counting and currency?
I do. I do. And TRA was heading in that direction. If you look at some of the things we included in some of the studies, we were measuring cinema advertising. We were measuring print. We were, of course, measuring TV and digital in all of its forms. We were measuring promotion, in-store promotion. We were getting set up to measure call centers and so on and so forth. And others are working along similar lines today. And I do believe, of course, WFA, ANA, ISBA, that initiative is highly focused on cross-platform, mostly on screens, but they will get there because once you have big data, you have the ability to match to things like subscriber lists and to geopath data. And then you're also measuring 100% of the population rather than the 30% that are research cooperators. But within the 30% that are research cooperators, of course, you can reweight them demographically, geographically, but not necessarily psychologically. You know, the things that are psychological about that 30%, like the fact that they favor Westerns on television much more than 70% who would never join a panel, stuff like that. However, panels can do things, co-viewing and so on, that big data can't do yet. So there will be a period of next probably 20 years where they'll be roughly equally important, which is fine. And adding new media to panels is easier. People have opted in. So you can ask them questions about any media type, even media types that maybe have to be measured based on people's statements. But you can also get them to perhaps do other things within a panel, even biometric things. You know, so I do see that it will eventually be cross-platform inclusive. Certainly isn't going to be there in the next 4 years because the fascination with just getting it right for TV and digital is overwhelming, and getting the privacy thing right. Right now, we're riding kind of like an very Poe-like pendulum. And the Poe-like pendulum is swinging from much too much leniency with regard to protecting consumer privacy to unnecessary degrees of obfuscation that are going to lower the deterministic ability to predict ROI. So it will lower the ROIs, definitely. And when that comes, that's merely a prophecy now. When everybody sees it, then there's going to be some pressure on the EU governance and everybody else, various states governance, to say, okay, let's find a better balance here. There are ways of doing it. Like TRA was so dedicated to privacy. I wrote the KC privacy principles, long before TRA, and the 4As, ANA and ARF put it up on their website. That it must be full disclosure. You can't sell people's data. It must be anonymized. It must be non-re-identifiable. People who have databases, you can't share back data with them that will give them more information than they had in the first place. Well, all of those rules were in TRA. And they did the job quite well, and they could do the job quite well in the future without us going to these excesses in zeal over privacy that mostly come from not understanding the tools.
And now it seems like the walled gardens issue is starting to even enter incremental spaces like connected televisions and AVODs. So where do you see all of that going? It's kind of an impediment to this cross-platform end goal.
Well, it's going to make publishers, and particularly video publishers like networks and MVPDs and streamers, AVODs, SVODs, and so on. All those people will still have perfect identity data, deterministic, and the right to use it based on the opt-in or opt-out that they've been using to legal specifications. So all of those people become more valuable. And that includes OTT and NCTV. But the buying through exchanges and all of that stuff, I think we're going to see a huge shift away from the very things that have been growing fastest in dollars. Those things are going to stop growing in dollars, and the dollars will start to go back to media where you can still do the things right. I think they're going to lose a lot by, like Google and Facebook and others have done fabulous work in creating the ability to do random control trials within their walled garden. Of course, you had to believe their results, but because it's a walled garden, but really beautifully designed random control trials, which led to my project with the ARF, the RCT21. And now that's impaired by their own new privacy guidelines. So you can't do that with cohorts. You can't match cohort sales to cohort sales. That's probabilistic. You can't do it. Which marketers using things like ARF, RCT21 can use what's called intent to treat. Intent to treat is basically a dollars-based in-out model where you say, here are my IDs, Geico, let's say. Geico takes 40 million IDs that they consider to be their targets. And they're actual names and addresses of people that made contact with them. Maybe there used to be Geico customers. However, they got the leads. They've got a first-party right to communicate with those people, and they're already communicating with them. So they take that list, they randomize it, they break it up into buckets using perhaps factorial design, and now they can look at several different media types in various combinations. And the media types can include Google and Facebook, because you don't need to measure the impressions. Those are interim measures. You're just looking at, I gave you this many IDs, I gave you this many dollars to send exposures to those IDs, and I'm able to measure the incremental sales I got out of those IDs. So Google, either you got me the sales that paid for what I paid you, or you didn't. And you can't stop that with anything you do, because I'm not measuring impressions. So I think that form of dollars in, dollars out ROI accountability will go way, way up in usage when you can't do it the way it's being done today.
Speaking of ROI, I want to backtrack a little bit. And, a lot of times I think in our channel, when we're talking about ROI, we're talking about national models, and out of home is obviously a very local channel. And our national buys aren't even, like they're not national buys, they're just bigger buys. How does local modeling work? How does local fit into the models, and how important is it in determining where the next dollar should go when you're making an investment in advertising?
Well, the interesting thing that I found out years ago is that brands, like any other innovation, when they disseminate to a population, they follow an S-curve. Just like Rogers said in this book, The Fusion of Innovation, that any new innovation, just like an epidemic, follows an S-curve. All epidemiologists know this. So
back up, what's an S-curve, Bill?
Well, an S-curve means that when you first start a new brand, in the beginning, the response in terms of sales to the advertising is very slow. But then you reach an inflection point where the curve turns upward, where you enter a fast growth phase, where while you're in that fast growth phase, every dollar you put into advertising pays back handsomely. And then you hit the other inflection point at the top of the S-curve, where all of a sudden you're topped out. You've saturated the market for your brand. Now here's the key. S-curves are different in every piece of geography. I didn't discover that till the 1980s. I brought that to the ANA and they made a big deal about it. And it should be a big deal because that's what indicates where local media should be used. They should be used in the fast growth markets. And how do you identify fast growth markets? Well, RMT has an easy and inexpensive technology that does that using whether it's IRI data or Polk data or client's own data or whatever it might be. But essentially you can predict where the ROIs are going to be the highest. And in those markets, you want more, per capita ad investment than in the markets, certainly that are topped out. You want to shift from, so to the degree that you have a lot of topped out geographic areas within a given country, you want to take money out of national media and put it in local media. Now, when I was working at Interpublic years and years ago, before I discovered the S-curve, McCann made a lot of headway with a pitch strategy that said other agencies that we're competing with probably told you that they were going to give you an optimized TV campaign that was 80% national, 20% spot TV. But we, McCann, are going to give you 60-40. We're going to put 40% in spot TV and 60% national TV. And why? Let's show you why. Okay, so here's the campaign that you ran with your current agency that you're reviewing right now that we're pitching against. Here's how it laid down targeted rating points, if you want, or GRPs, whatever you want, across the country. And you can see the bars going up and down, or we can show you on a deviation from the average. You think you're getting 2,000 GRPs. Well, yeah, but in this market, you're getting 1,000. That happens to be New York, incidentally. And then in these smaller markets where there are fewer stations, the ratings are highest. And that's where you're getting enormous, much too much. If 2,000 is perfect, then you're getting much too much there. That was before I knew that it isn't just a matter of, McCann was mostly interested in the idea of replacement weight. That if you don't buy too much national, then you can put the spot where you need it to bring it up to where you think that market has to be. But without S-curve, you didn't really know where you should be putting it. Now with S-curve, you know where you should be putting it, and you can determine how much national media versus local media would optimize. And that isn't limited to television. It's all national and local media. We just announced a new optimizer we created, Bill Harvey Consulting and Partners, called OptiBrain, whose main focus is national local optimization.
And so part of that also, I think, is test and learn, right?
Every advertiser should consider that every dollar they're spending is measurable and is a learning experience. In addition, they should be doing experiments. And the experiments ought to fall into two categories. One category is it's really easy to do geographically matched testing. It's not as perfect as random control trials, but it's really easy to do. Like Ocean Spray does it constantly. Ocean Spray is constantly doing geographic matched panel testing, and they're learning tremendous amounts from it. The one logical way to do it is to see what you're doing that's working and heavy it up. If it's working, let's heavy it up. Well, how do you determine where to heavy it up? Well, you could look at the S-curve data, and then you can begin to do, it is a best practice, I believe, and many people have already adopted 10% of the budget to test innovation constantly. I believe in that. Not everybody's doing it, but having an official test and learn regime, to me, makes the most sense, both from looking at the data as it fell naturally, just observing it, looking at correlations, which is what MMM and MTA are doing, plus doing experimentation, which gives you causality, correlation, and then you can act more confidently based on that.
So just to pivot real quick, talking about, one of the strengths I think of out of home as we're talking about local is recency, which I know is, something that's been a key focus point for you. Do you want to talk a little bit about recency and why it's important and what kind of impact it has on consumers?
Well, John Philip Jones, using IRI data, provided some data to Erwin Efron. Erwin Efron created the whole idea of recency based on looking at that data. And because there's a forgetting or you might call it an ad decay curve, that after an ad exposure, it's not doing the job as well the further you go in time from that ad exposure. Although studies also show that it goes on to infinity, that there is a long-term effect. People like Chuck Young have shown that people remember advertising 9 years later if it was good advertising. But recency emerges as a result of the fact that you don't know when people are going to buy. Sure, you can do studies to see what is the best shopping day. Used to be Wednesdays, now it's Saturdays. When people shop for cars, normally weekends. Okay, you can take that into account. But there's convenience, interim shopping trips. So you're never sure when it's important that somebody's about to have the moment of truth. They're going to buy something, and you better be in the previous 2 days of their memory with some advertising. And the closer you can come, if it's a matter of minutes or hours, that's the best. That has the most impact. And outdoor and radio are both in that category of, and to some extent mobile, all are in that, and in-store advertising. All of those are in that category of that last mile before the moment of truth of buying something. And they don't get enough credit for it, and they don't get enough allocation of spend toward it, mostly because the big spend categories occupy all available mental space for the ever-shrinking teams. Particularly in the post-COVID environment, people are thinking about, okay, do more with less. Well, good luck. We weren't even doing an adequate job with what we had. We were looking at 80% of the variables and, assuming the heck with the other 20%. No, not the heck with them. You don't even know which variables are important, but you do know that recency is important. That's one of the ones that you can be pretty certain about. The other thing is when you look at fast reach, there are certain media that can attain fast reach. And if you can get fast reach, you get recency. Dave Poltrack, Leslie Wood, and I proved that at an ARF Chicago session a couple of years ago, where we showed that, for example, high-rated, not that there's a lot of that, but the small amount of high-rated television programming that still exists builds reach fast. Good optimizers that use big data. Now, if you run an optimizer against the Nielsen panel, you get a lot of good insight. But the one thing it doesn't really do a good job on is the duplication between shows. Because the shows, have an average of, 1/10 of 1% reach. And then when you look at the overlap between them, it's the square of that. So it's really small. So measuring duplication in a panel is very, very challenging. You can get a certain amount of optimization. But with big data, Simulmedia proved, for example, that you can get excellent with small, low-rated stuff on television. And outdoor has over and again proved to people who have tested outdoor that it gets fast reach. 100 showing within a day or two, if you've put up something that is relevant, eye-catching, and newsworthy, or in any way unique, or catches, makes people think, people are talking about it. It creates buzz. It hits the marketplace. The other thing I wanted to say about outdoor in particular is it encodes in the brain differently than other media. Each media type has different ways of encoding in the brain, which creates the predisposition to buy a brand. That's what the encoding does. It creates predisposition, increases the likelihood that the brand's being considered, that it'll be noticed on the shelf, that its future ads will be noticed, that the brand will be thought about in any relevant conversation. So you want that brand encoding, but it takes place in different ways. With screen media are notably distracting and cluttered. There's other stuff around it, unless you buy island position, which you have to pay a big premium for and you mostly can't get anyway. But island position in television is the closest thing to outdoor. There's nothing around it to distract you from it. And it doesn't encode the same way as screen media. Screen media, you're looking at a screen, but either you're sitting close to it or not close to it. The close or not close does make a difference in the encoding, but it's all that type of encoding. It's different from magazine encoding, different from radio encoding, different from outdoor encoding. Every study I've ever seen shows that, and ARF covered this really well, I think, in in the last 10 years, why advertising works. All of the work that they did in meta-analyses shows that you get to a certain inflection point and you should leave your base media and go to a second medium, and then to a third medium and a fourth medium, as you begin to see the tipping over of the S curve and the reach curve, which mirrors that. So the more media and the more different types of encoding, and this feeds right into your question about test and learn. Like if they haven't tested outdoor in 10 years, why not? Why haven't they tested it outdoor in 10 years? Have they noticed that outdoor is growing? Have they noticed that outdoor has case studies of impact, ROI levels? That it has, thanks to your work and Scott's work and your whole team's work, the best interface for getting at big data is close to a programmatic way for planning as possible, to pick out the inventory to activate upon. So those are the things that I think make outdoor different and worth testing.
Final quick question then. Bill, if you had access to put any message up on all of the out-of-home inventory across the United States, what would that message be?
Focus on the solution, not the problem.
Love it. Thank you so much, Bill. This has been awesome. I could talk to you for a decade. I really appreciate your time today. This has been so fun. If anybody has any questions who's watching or listening, you can always email us at geekout@geopath.org with the subject line, Speaking Frankly Questions. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.